Welcome to today's video all about brewing better dark roasts as filter coffee. We're not really going to touch on espresso today, just brewed coffee. How to make it more delicious when you're starting with a darker roast. Now historically, this channel hasn't talked about dark roasts, it's talked about light roasts most of the time. And that's because within the sort of specialty coffee world, people tend to gravitate towards lighter roasts, because you tend to see more kind of taste of place, more of the origin characteristics in a coffee that is lighter roasted. It'll have more floral or fruity kind of qualities. It'll often be a little bit more aromatic. It may be a little bit more sweet, but it will often be much more acidic as a result. Now, when you roast coffee, the longer you roast coffee, the more you will sort of degrade that acidity, the more it will decline. But the longer you roast coffee, the more bitterness you typically will get. This happens in loads of other things, the most obvious being caramels. That starts as very sweet. The darker you take it, the more bitter it becomes, the less sweet it becomes. But take it too far and you've burnt it. And it just tastes bad, be that caramel, be that coffee. So in this video, I'm not going to be advocating for coffee taken all the way to pretty much burnt or kind of charcoal, at that point. That is a thing that you see. I'm not a huge advocate for that in any way. By darker roasts, what I typically mean, especially when talking about filter coffee, is that the coffee is taken probably to the point where you're beginning to see oils on the surface of the bean. During roasting, a lot of pressure builds up inside a coffee bean. Initially, that'll cause it to pop or crack relatively early in the process, and as you keep roasting, it can happen again. There can be a second crack, a second release of pressure, but all of that time, this internal pressure in the bean is pushing oils to the surface, which is why darker roasts look much oilier on the outside. Now, I will say right now, one of the challenges of darker roasts is that this process of pushing oil to the surface, this longer roasting process, gives you a more porous coffee bean. You can feel that when you crush them in your fingers. It's much easier to crush a dark roasted bean than a light roasted one. Being more porous exposes it to more air, and ultimately dark roasted coffee will stale much faster. So this brings us actually to tip number 1. Pay attention to freshness more than ever. With lighter roasted coffees, you'll typically see recommendations of buy it as freshly as you can, let it degas for maybe a week, and then you've got somewhere between 3 and 6 weeks is the kind of typical range of recommendations in which to drink the coffee, in which it will taste good. Darker roasts, everything is a bit accelerated. They'll degas faster, but they'll also have generated more CO2 in the roasting process, so they still do need and still do benefit from a little bit of resting. However, once you start to brew, you'll begin to notice stale flavors much sooner than you would do with lighter roasts. So I would say you really want to be using it within 2-3 weeks, sort of maximum, if you want the best possible experience. It's still perfectly drinkable beyond that point, but you're not necessarily getting what you paid your good money for in terms of flavor. Now, in making this video, I had to think about who is this video for, and I think there are 2 groups of people who would benefit from what we're going to talk about today. Group 1 are people that drink dark roasted filter coffee every day. And I want them to enjoy it a little bit more because I want everyone to enjoy coffee a little bit more. And then there's group 2, people who don't really like the taste of dark roasted coffee as filter coffee, but might be stuck with nothing else to brew and wondering, how do I get the best out of this? Now, I'm working on the idea that you both want the same thing. You want as much complexity as possible from the coffee, as little bitterness as possible from the coffee. You want texture, you want body, you want mouthfeel, and you want it to be as enjoyable as it can be. Now, bitterness is a complex subject in coffee. A lot of people really dislike bitterness, but they prefer dark roast because they really dislike acidity. And I understand that. Having an acidic cup of coffee to many people is a kind of revolting idea or a very unpleasant idea. They've learned that the taste of coffee is typically more bitter, and so often that's dosed with a little dairy or a little bit of sugar to soften the bitterness, to hide the bitterness a little bit. And that's the kind of benchmark of how coffee tastes for them. And again, I'm trying to make coffee taste good, so even if you're putting cream or sugar into it, it tastes that little bit more enjoyable, that little bit more pleasurable. But if you do want to explore coffee with less of those things in it because it doesn't need them because it is less bitter, then it should be a welcoming and interesting cup if you start to drop the sugar maybe, or try it with a little less cream or no cream one day, just to see what you think, see what the coffee itself tastes like. So now it's time to talk about brewing coffee, and I'm going to recommend, with a pour over, using a paper filter. Now, if you like a French press, if you like that sort of sediment thing, go with it. If that's your actual preference, then keep doing that. But if it's not, if you just want to reduce bitterness, then I would recommend paper filters. The reason they work is that they don't let any tiny pieces of coffee through into the brew. Those tiny pieces do taste bitterness. They add an extra layer of bitterness to the cup. So removing it does remove some bitterness from the brew right at the start. A lot of people, I think, like Chemex papers in particular for this. They're much thicker papers. They're 2 to 3 times heavier than, say, a V60 paper, but a V60 paper, in my experience, works well enough to capture all the bits and pieces and leave you with a nice, clean cup. Now, the coffee that we're using today is relatively dark for filter coffee. You can see there is a little bit of oil coming to the surface. They're getting that kind of sheen. Over time, these would get oilier. So when it comes to brewing, the first thing we'll talk about is grind size. Now, when you roast a coffee darker, it's easier to extract that coffee. Confusingly, there's less stuff to extract. As you roast coffee, more and more of it comes away as either smoke or other things, and it kind of disappears. There's less soluble material in darker roasted coffee than there is in lighter roasted coffee, but it's more soluble. What's left is easier to get. So I would recommend you grinding notably coarser for a darker roast than a light roast. I'll show you on screen now a comparison between where I would grind for, say, a V60 of a light roast versus a V60 of a dark roast. Now, this gets us immediately into a slightly confusing topic, which is that of extraction. I want to reduce my extraction. I don't want to under-extract the coffee. Essentially, that often happens by, not extracting the coffee evenly. I want to do it all evenly. I just want a little bit less from the coffee. And again, that's where a coarser grind comes into it. Now, because the coffee is much more fragile, when it is ground, it does shatter and produce more fines. It's extremely brittle. So typically you can get more fines with darker roasts. You could argue that you should sift out those fines. That would help reduce the bitterness of a brew. I'm not 100% there on sifting because it feels wasteful. I end up with coffee that I have to just throw away. And I would rather go a different route to a better cup. Now, if you have an enormous amount of patience, you can slowly feed the coffee into your grinder rather than throw it in all at once. That will help reduce fines too. We made a video about that up here if you want to check that out. I'm not saying you have to do that. It's just a thing worth noting. So, our coffee is in. And the second thing about the recipe is that we're going to use a much higher dose. I would recommend something closer to 70 grams per litre rather than 60. We are grinding coarser and that will reduce our extraction, and that would then reduce the strength of the cup, which we don't necessarily want to do. So we're going to increase the dose to increase the strength again. So 70 grams a litre works super well. And then we need to talk about brew temperature. Now, this is a slightly complicated subject. In the past, I've given you broad guidelines, which is the darker the roast, the lower the brew temperature that you want to use. Now, I've been spending some time trying to unpick this a little bit more, and I stand by that. I certainly wouldn't recommend using boiling water, just off the boil to brew this entire V60, because you'd end up with some dominant bitterness, a pretty harsh aftertaste, a little bit of smoke there, and that brew would definitely be improved by dairy and sugar, or a dairy alternative and sugar, but maybe we don't have to do that. And yes, if I just had one option of brewing different temperatures, I'd be, with a roast this dark, looking at 80 to 85 as a brew temperature. And that would produce quite a soft, gentle brew. But recently I've been experimenting with trying to get a bit more complexity in the cup while still retaining the qualities of that lower brew temperature. And I'll tell you what I came up with after this quick ad from this video's sponsor, which is Squarespace. From websites to online stores to marketing tools, Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to help you build a beautiful presence for you online or for your business. Now, there's loads of different reasons to build a website. It might be a portfolio for you and your work. It might be a blog that you want to write and share with the world. It might be a representation of your cafe or restaurant online. It can be overwhelming to start with, and that's where Squarespace's templates are a lifesaver. Start there. Start with something beautiful. Start with something that's going to work on mobile, on every platform, every browser, and begin to fill it with your words, your images, your character, your personality. It's incredibly easy to use. It's intuitive to move things around. Build a website that feels like it's truly yours. But don't just take my word for it. Go sign up below. You can get a free trial, build a website, create something, and when you're ready to launch, use code James Hoffmann for 10% off any website or domain. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. So here's the deal. This is kind of a technique that I've used in the past when brewing espresso, where I've had a bit of control over temperature and boilers and that kind of stuff. I've found that, same thing with espresso, you want to pull shots at, say, 80 degrees C with dark roasts to have a heavy-bodied, full, rich, not overly bitter cup. But if you are able to start with very hot water right at the beginning, just to get the extraction going, you tend to have a more complex and interesting cup. That's what we're going to do here. If you're willing to do a bit of work, this is kind of interesting. So I would say if you start with boiling water just for the bloom, and then brew the rest of the brew at 80 degrees Celsius, for example, you end up with more complexity, but not too much bitterness. Plenty of extraction, plenty of body, plenty of texture, but a cleaner, smoother aftertaste. I would be speculating if I was to tell you why this was the case. So know that right now. Firstly, you'd notice that the bloom with 80 degrees C water and boiling water is very different. You get a lot more degassing from the coffee with water freshly off the boil. And you are beginning an extraction process there, though your ratio of water to coffee is pretty inefficient and the temperature drop is pretty rapid as that boiling water hits room temperature coffee. But it seems to me that you pull out just a little bit more in that phase, but in the remainder of the brew at 80 degrees C, you don't really extract those harsh, bitter things that need higher temperatures to get out into your brew. Now, if this seems impractical, then I would agree to some extent it is, though it's not the end of the world. If you have a temperature-controlled kettle, then this isn't too difficult. What you're going to do is take about half to 2/3 of the water that you'll need, and you'll bring that up to boiling point, and you'll pour what you need for the bloom. Put it back on the stand, change your target temperature, add cold water, and enough to drop the temperature below your target, and then let it come up to 80. That can comfortably be done in the 45 seconds that I would recommend blooming the coffee for. Now, because you're brewing with coarser ground coffee, do expect a faster overall brew time as well. And so what you end up with, I think, is a brew that plays to the strengths of the coffee. At that darker roast, it has a higher capacity for body and texture and richness, and we should work with that. Use that. It has reduced acidity, and that means we can play with a lower extraction level without throwing the cup out of balance. But it can reduce the bitterness, the harshness of that, and end up with something very tasty if you like more developed flavors. And if you don't, then I think it's not so far away from the kind of coffees that you enjoy that you have to completely cover it with dairy or sugar or something to kind of mask the things that you really dislike. What I think you end up with is a very friendly cup of coffee. And ultimately, for me, the goal here is that people, as a whole, drink and enjoy coffee and value coffee more. I would rather people were drinking dark roasts from great producers, great green coffees, that had been roasted a way that maybe I don't love, but I'd still rather they drank those than drank dark roasts of lower quality coffees or coffees produced at below the cost of production, as still happens out there. Just because I really prefer lighter roasts doesn't mean that I should say that those are better somehow or those are correct or right. But now I want to hear from you down in the comments below. Did you try this technique? Did you grind a little coarser, dose a little higher, play around with your brew temperature? Did you like the resulting cup? Do you usually drink your coffee with dairy, with cream, with sugar? Did you try it without? How was it? Let me know what I missed. Let me know what techniques you've found for making a better tasting dark roasted filter coffee. I'd love to hear from all of you down in the comments below. But for now, I'll say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.